Hi, and welcome to another economics lecture. This one is obviously on gross domestic product, part of macroeconomics. And today I'm going to cover some brief but important concepts that have to do obviously with gross domestic product. So here we go. So first thing to remember is, what is the essential question that we're trying to figure out in economics? And of course that again is, how do we know if we have a healthy economy or not? And like I mentioned yesterday, there are three components. The first thing we want is steady economic growth, okay? And how we answer that question is we look at gross domestic product, or GDP. So what is GDP? Okay, the definition of GDP is basically, as you can see here, the dollar value of all final goods and services produced by a country in 1 year. Some of the key components you need to know is, first thing is final. What that means is products that are sold to individuals or businesses. That is, things that are on the shelf that you and I buy, or services that we buy from producers. Okay. It also means, I should say, that it has to be produced inside the country. So that means the Apple iPhone you bought is not considered part of a GDP because that was produced in another country, while the Honda car that you bought was produced in Kentucky, and so that would be included. So we don't care what the company is, we care where that company produced the product. So that's a key thing to consider when you say what is GDP. And just to give you a sense of what it's like, last year our GDP, as you can see, was just close to $17 trillion in 1 year. That makes us #1 in the world. So we produce a lot of goods and services in this country. Okay? So what makes up GDP? How do they come up with that massive number? There are basically four key components, which I'm going to go through now and that you need to know. The first is personal consumption. This is basically anytime you and I go out and buy something. It's going to be part of the C of personal consumption. A little more specifically, it's made up of two big components. First, what we call durable consumer goods. These are things like you see the pictures over here, items that we buy once in a while, in several years, not every day, but things that last. Okay, so obviously you could also put cars over here, homes, things like that. Along with that are also what we call non-durable consumer goods. And as you can see from this list here, it's basically things that you need on a more regular basis. Things that you use up relatively quickly and then you have to consume more of. It also includes services that we use because obviously once you use it, that service, it's gone. So it's only a one-time shot. So these two big components basically make up personal consumption which is one of the largest parts of GDP. It actually makes up 70% of gross domestic product. And so that basically tells you that our GDP is hugely affected by you and I going shopping. So yes, you can argue with your parents to help the economy, they should take you shopping. The next thing is investment, business investment, which we call this I. Okay. That basically refers to any time a business spends money to improve its company. As you can see these pictures, that means buying new tools for the company, building factories, or even training employees. Anytime a company spends money that may eventually lead to making more profit, that's considered business investment. So the next time in the newspaper you see that a company just spent $500 million on a new factory, you know that's part of investment expenditure, or an I in GDP. The next component is what we call government purchases of goods and services, or a G, as you can see in the upper right hand corner. Now this includes spending by the federal government, state governments, and also local governments. So that can mean anything from producing things for our military, obviously funding for our schools, yay, and also just improving or maintaining our roads. Anytime the government spends money, it helps GDP. So if you think about it, and we'll talk about this later, is if the government wants to help GDP, it spends money. And we'll talk about that as one of the ways in which it deals with economic problems that we have. But government spending, again, is a big component of GDP as well. Finally, there's something we call net exports. And that is simply taking the amount of exports we have as a nation and we subtract out the imports. So that's basically what this says here. An export, again, is something that is made inside the United States, and yet then we ship it to another country where it's bought. Okay, and you can see here, this is all the places that we ship our goods to, which is basically just about every place you can imagine. Okay, we don't want to include imports because that's money that we spend that goes outside the country. That supports factories and workers outside the United States, and we're only trying to measure what we produce inside this country as part of GDP. Okay, so you take these four components and you add them all up in this pretty formula. As you can see, GDP is C plus I plus G plus X. You have to know this formula just so you know how GDP is tabulated, and you put these all together and you basically get your GDP per year. What we're looking for is that if this number, whatever it is per year, grows at a 3 to 5% per year, we say we have economic growth. This is real important for you to know, that basically to have steady economic growth every year, our economy needs to grow between 3 and 5% per year. So what does that mean, or how does that look over time? Well, let me show you some data. This first graph, as you can see, is GDP growth from -15 all the way to 20% growth over the years, starting way back in 1930, going all the way through 2010. And you can see it goes up and down. It very much looks like the business cycle, which is exactly where the business cycle comes from. You can see that during the Great Depression, we were trying to spend our way out of it, and you can see a lot of production GDP, and yet it's still, and then it drops after World War II. Okay, it was really low in the beginning during the Great Depression. Okay, and then after the 1950s, okay, into the 70s, this was when we had a massive expansion, and you can see it does drop. This is a pretty good sized recession. There's another tiny one here, and then this one, of course, is the most recent, 2008, where gross domestic product dropped below 0%. To give you a little more specific view, here it is more recently. Obviously, you can see that we were growing above close to 3%, and then we dropped pretty significantly below, almost to 10% during the Great Recession of 2008, and then we've been kind of above it, not always at 3%, but getting close a couple of times. So you can see that, you know, GDP has not consistently been above 3%, but there have been times when it's been much higher, and there have been times much lower. But again, this is basically the business cycle. But again, key here is to see how it goes up, but still not above 3% all the time, and obviously we've never really hit even 5%. So we're still struggling to try to meet those goals. Okay, moving on. There's some other important things that what GDP tells us. The first thing is it tells about income levels. If you think about it, every time something is produced, it creates income. And what I mean by that is obviously someone has to be paid to produce the product or offer the service. So that number of over almost $17 trillion, that creates a massive amount of income for people in this country. So another way to think of that GDP number is how much money people have in terms of income. And of course, what do people do with income? Is they spend it. Okay, so that $16.8 trillion, a majority of that is going to be used in spending of other goods and services. So basically, the higher your GDP, the higher your income levels, and the higher levels of expenditures or spending that you can have. And both those are obviously good. The higher those are, the better they are for any nation. Okay. Also, okay, using GDP, you can sort of measure what we call standard of living. Oops. The standard of living is simply defined here as basically how much wealth and basically material stuff you have in your life. And obviously we assume that the more money and the more material wealth you have, the better your standard of living. Okay, so what we get here basically is a higher standard of living means a higher quality of life, and we always talk about how we try to get a higher quality of life for every generation. Okay, so that's what GDP can tell us if it rises over time. Next, we have something called GDP per capita. Okay, and basically what that does is, as it says, you take your GDP and just divide it by the number of people. Okay, and that can be really effective because what that does is that allows you to compare the GDP of one nation and compare it more honestly and fairly with another nation. Okay, we have, you know, a GDP with 300 million people. Okay, China has a GDP, but it has over 1.2 billion people. For us to compare the United States to China's GDP, we need to look at it per person. Okay, and this link here will show you what that looks like. So let's go to it now. Okay. So what this graph shows you is here is the GDP for the world for the last almost 9 years. Okay, and this is the world. I'm going to put the United States in real quick, and you'll see what happens. There we are over here. You can see we were down at 41,000, and last year we were almost 53,000. Okay, way above the average for the rest of the world. Let's put in China. Okay, let's see where that is. And you can see China is at 6,600. Gets a little higher at 8,500, and most recently it was at 10,500. Higher than the world average, but much, much lower than where we are. We are almost 5 times, our GDP per capita is 5 times what China is, which is pretty impressive considering what we have. Let's put in Sierra Leone just to see where that would be. Okay, this is obviously, we send money to Sierra Leone almost every year. They're dealing with the Ebola crisis, and you can see here that in 2004, if I can get it, I can't get it so low, but most recent year it was just over $800 per year was GDP per capita. And you can imagine, compare that to ours, you can understand why our standard of living or quality of life is so much higher than theirs. Okay, let's go back to where we were. So, moving on. One last thing we need to look at is called nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal GDP is only this GDP that just takes what current prices are. Just meaning if it looks at what the value of the products are in that year. Okay, real GDP, when you calculate using real GDP, what you do is you take price changes into account. So let me explain what that means. Okay, when you're trying to figure out what GDP is, you always want to look at, first of all, the final goods, and you want to avoid all the production stages, meaning you only want to look at the product when it's actually being sold. So let me give you an example. Let's look at this brand new BMW all-electric car, okay, which was produced this year and is being sold. Should this be included in GDP? The answer is, of course it should be. It's produced this year and therefore is assuming it was produced in the United States and therefore it should be part of GDP. Okay. What about a car that was produced in 2008 but is now being sold on Craigslist? Okay. The answer here is no, because it was already included in 2008 when it was produced. If we count it again when it was sold on Craigslist this year, that would be called double counting. Okay, that would make GDP go up, but unfortunately it would not be very accurate. So anything that's sold used on Craigslist, on eBay, any of those things, any of those items or services would not be included. Specifically, obviously goods, services would be. Okay, so therefore no used items in GDP. Okay, the last thing you need to look at is what's the difference between nominal and real GDP. Here's a basic example. Let's say we have a real basic economy with 2 basic products, Pop-Tarts and cell phones. The only 2 things you need really to survive. So let's have some prices and quantities. So in this example, we have 100 Pop-Tarts and each sells for $1, while we produce 10 cell phones and they sell for $100. What that means is we get a total of $100 worth of Pop-Tarts and $1,000 worth of cell phones. For a grand total of 1,000 plus 100 gives you $1,100 in GDP for 2013. Okay, let's say the next year we have the same products. Okay, again we produce 100. This time we produce 100 Pop-Tarts. This time they cost $5. Meanwhile, we produce 10 cell phones, and this time they cost $200. Do the basic math. That means the Pop-Tarts are worth $500. The cell phones are worth $2,000, giving us a GDP of $2,500. To see how our GDP changed, we just take the percent change. Okay, when you do that, it says that GDP rose by 127%, right? 1,100 to 25, that's more than double. Okay, so that's awesome. That means that your GDP is doing, it's just rocking, right? Or did it? Let's look a little closer. Okay, first of all, look at the quantities produced. In 2013 and 2014, you will notice they're the exact same. The amount of production has not changed at all. What did change was the price. The price for Pop-Tarts was $1 in 2013, and then it went to $5. Cell phones went from 100 to 200. All that happened was that prices rose. GDP levels did not change. This is what happens if you use nominal GDP. It can artificially inflate your GDP changes. So you should always use real, never nominal. Okay, that was fast and furious. Feel free to watch it a few more times. I'll have a few questions for you next time we meet. Have a good night. Bye-bye.